We already picked out a beautiful room for you at Shady Pines Nursing Home, Mom. Maya smiled as she slid the bowl of mashed potatoes across the dinner table. We need your master bedroom to expand the filming studio, and Jason agrees that you're far too old to be managing a house this big anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply took a slow sip of my wine and smiled back at her carefully painted face. What they didn't know was that my signature on the legal documents they were about to push across the table would be written in disappearing ink. And they certainly didn't know that the $2.5 million mansion we were sitting in had already been legally transferred to an anonymous trust 6 months earlier. But before I tell you how I brought down the delusional parasites in my own family, using the very same skills I once used to hunt down tax criminals for the government, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to quietly gather evidence while toxic relatives underestimated your worth. My name is Evelyn. I'm 62 years old. I'm a former senior forensic accountant, and this is the story of how I audited my own family. It was Thanksgiving night. The dining room of my classic New Jersey home was filled with the smell of roasted turkey and the expensive scented candles Maya had insisted on buying with my credit card. I sat at the head of the long oak table. I had bought that table with overtime pay earned from sleepless nights buried in financial fraud reports, while my ex-husband spent his afternoons on the golf course. Maya, my daughter-in-law, sat to my right. She was a 32-year-old social media influencer who genuinely believed that pretty plates of food could make up for the lack of a real personality. Her perfectly manicured French tips tapped impatiently against her crystal wine glass. Jason. My 34-year-old son sat beside her. He was wearing a designer sweater that cost more than my first car. He ran a tech company that was burning through investor money, but tonight, all of his attention was fixed on one thing: my assets. "Mom, you have to be realistic," Jason said, leaning forward with that condescending tone I knew too well. "Managing a property like this is too much of a burden for someone your age. Maya needs the space for her brand collaborations, and we could help manage your finances a lot better if you just sign over power of attorney to us tonight." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. It was a power of attorney form. Maya jumped in with a voice dripping in fake sympathy. "We only want what's best for you, Evelyn. The nursing home has a lovely garden where you can relax. You've worked hard enough. It's time to step aside and let the younger generation take the wheel." I looked at both of them. I noticed the faint nervous tremor in Jason's left hand. It was a tell he had never been able to control one that only surfaced when he was lying or when he was hungry for money. I noticed the limited edition designer handbag sitting at Maya's feet, a bag her pitiful social media earnings could never have paid for. 30 years of analyzing fraudulent ledgers had taught me how to read people just as well as I read bank statements. They thought they were dealing with a fragile old woman who would obediently hand over the life she had spent decades building. They thought my silence meant surrender. I picked up the heavy brass pen resting beside my plate. Then I looked straight into Jason's eyes and prepared to sign away the imaginary kingdom they thought they were about to steal. Maya picked up the carving knife and started hacking into the turkey. She didn't know how to follow the joints. She just forced the blade downward with brute strength, tearing the meat into ragged, uneven chunks. I sat at the head of the table and watched her destroy the meal I had spent 6 hours roasting. The heavy gold bracelets on her wrist clinked against the porcelain serving platter. She was wearing a silk blouse that cost more than my first car. I took a slow sip of water. I didn't offer to help. I simply let her struggle. This dining table was made of solid mahogany. I bought it 22 years ago. I remember the exact day because it was also the same week I finished paying off the mortgage on this house. My ex-husband Richard was out playing golf with the men from his little country club circle. I was sitting in the very same seat Jason now occupied, surrounded by stacks of bank statements and tax returns. I had spent my entire career as a senior forensic accountant for the IRS. I made my living tracking offshore accounts and shell companies. I worked 80 hours a week. I missed school performances and summer vacations so I could build a fortress of financial security for my family. I paid for this house with my own sweat and my own sharp eyes. And now the two people sitting across from me were treating me like some senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with a checkbook. "You forgot the cranberry sauce again, Mom," Jason said. He let out a long, exaggerated sigh and tossed his fork onto the plate. It was a calculated sigh. A staged performance meant to establish my incompetence. I had not forgotten the cranberry sauce. I had deliberately chosen not to make it because last month Maya had gone on one of her strict no-sugar diets for her social media channel and thrown a fit when I offered her dessert. But I didn't say that. I simply looked at him. "It's okay, Jason," Maya said softly. She leaned over and patted his hand. Her voice dripped with fake concern. "She's just getting forgetful. We've talked about this, remember? It's completely normal at her age. I was 62 years old. My mind was sharper than a steel trap. Just yesterday, I had audited Jason's startup records from my laptop out of pure curiosity. I had seen the terrifying burn rate. I had seen the desperate loans. I had seen thousands of dollars funneled into Maya's luxury shopping habit under the label of marketing expenses. They were drowning in debt. And they were looking at me like I was a life raft. "It's not just the cranberry sauce," Mom, Jason continued. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on my mahogany table. "Last week you left the porch light on for 2 nights in a row, and the lawn needs trimming. This house is just too much for you to manage by yourself now. You're slipping. It isn't safe for you to stay here alone." Maya nodded eagerly, her perfectly styled hair bouncing around her shoulders. "We're really worried about you, Evelyn. We truly are. What if you fall down those big stairs? What if you forget to turn off the stove and start a fire? We would never forgive ourselves if something happened to you just because we didn't step in and help." Help. That was what they called it. I knew exactly what kind of help they wanted to offer. "We think it's time for you to move somewhere smaller," Jason said. His tone shifted from concerned son to aggressive businessman. "We found a really wonderful assisted living place, Shady Pines. They have round-the-clock care. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing anymore. Maya and I could take over the property here. We could renovate the master bedroom into a filming studio for her brand. And I could use the equity in the house to keep my company afloat until the next funding round. It's a win-win for everyone." I looked at my son, the boy I had stayed up with until 3 a.m, helping him with calculus homework in high school, the boy whose entire elite college tuition I had paid by cashing out my own stock options. He was sitting in my house eating my food calmly, explaining how he planned to strip away the work of my entire life so he could bankroll his own failures. "You need to let us manage your investment portfolio," Mom, Jason said, pushing the conversation even further. "You don't understand how modern finance works anymore. The market is too volatile for someone your age to navigate. You need power of attorney. You need someone who knows what they're doing to protect your assets before you lose everything to a scammer or a bad investment." The irony nearly made me choke. The only scammers in my house were sitting right at my dinner table. I remained completely silent. In my profession, silence was a weapon. When you interrogate a suspect accused of wire fraud, you don't yell. You don't interrupt. You let them talk. People hate silence. They rush to fill it with words, and every word they speak gives you more ammunition. So I let the silence stretch. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Maya shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Jason cleared his throat. "It's all for your own good, Evelyn," Maya added, her voice a little higher this time. "You know we love you. We just want you to be safe and comfortable. You don't want to become a burden on us, do you?" "A burden?" I smiled. A very small, very polite smile. It was the exact same smile I used to wear when I handed a tax evader their final audit report. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. They exchanged a quick, triumphant glance. They thought my quiet response meant surrender. They thought they had succeeded in breaking me. They believed their little psychological manipulation had worked perfectly. In their minds, they had already started spending my money. They had already begun tearing down the walls of my bedroom. But as I watched Maya finally give up on carving properly and slap a shredded pile of turkey onto Jason's plate, my mind was already several moves ahead. They wanted to play a numbers game with a forensic accountant. They wanted to audit my life. They had no idea I had already finished auditing theirs. and the penalty for their fraud was going to be devastating. Jason slipped his hand into the black leather briefcase resting beneath his chair. The sound of the metal zipper cut sharply through the silence in the dining room. He pulled out a neatly clipped stack of documents and slowly pushed it across the polished mahogany table. The packet slid over the surface with a soft rustling sound before stopping right in front of my plate. The title on the first page was printed in bold, unmistakable letters, General Power of Attorney. "You only need to sign the last page, Mom," Jason said, trying to keep his voice calm, but I could hear the tension trembling at the end of his sentence. "Our company lawyer drafted everything. It covers it all: financial management, medical decisions, and authority over real estate assets. You won't have to worry about utility bills or property taxes anymore. We'll take care of everything for you." I didn't touch the documents. I simply looked at them, then slowly raised my eyes and looked straight into my son's face. In 30 years working for the IRS, I had sat across from dozens of executives, bankers, and some of the most seasoned fraudsters imaginable. I had learned that people can control their words, but they rarely control their bodies when they are lying. And right now, Jason's body was screaming deception. His blinking rate had doubled. When a person tells the truth, they blink around 15 to 20 times a minute. Jason's eyes were fluttering nonstop, easily over 40 times a minute. It was a natural physiological response when the brain was overworking itself to maintain a lie. On top of that, he couldn't hold my gaze for more than 3 seconds at a time. His eyes kept dropping to the documents, then darting away toward the painting hanging on the wall behind me. His right hand was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. He was afraid that I would actually read the terms. Maya was no better. She was trying to play the role of the loving, devoted daughter-in-law, but the mask was far too thin. She leaned forward, elbows pressed against the table, fingers laced tightly together. The corners of her mouth lifted into a polished, manufactured smile, but her jaw was locked so tightly it bulged beneath her makeup. "This would really be a relief for you, Evelyn," Maya said in that high, sugary voice of hers. "You could spend your golden years actually enjoying life instead of stressing over numbers. We can move you into Shady Pines as early as next week. You'll have new friends, nurses, to take care of your health, and Jason can refinance the house so it won't just sit here going to waste." Refinance. Such a clever little word. A clean, polished word meant to disguise the truth. Mortgage it, strip it, drain it for every dollar it was worth. I slowly reached out and turned the first page. I didn't need to read every line to know exactly what was inside. I had reviewed hundreds of contracts just like this in my career. When you sign a general power of attorney, you are essentially signing away your own civil existence. You give someone else the power to empty your bank accounts, sell the house you live in, and decide whether you live or die in a hospital bed. And my own son, the child I had carried, raised, and sacrificed for, wanted me to hand him that power with my own pen. My finger glided over the clause governing real estate authority. "You see this section here?" "Clause 4, I asked slowly, my voice stripped of any emotion. "The appointed agent has full authority to mortgage, transfer, or sell any real property titled under the principal's name. That is a very great deal of power, Jason." Jason cleared his throat. His Adam's apple bobbed. "That's just standard legal language, Mom," he said quickly. "It's there in case of an emergency, if you're no longer of sound mind to make decisions. I'm your son. Do you really think I would ever hurt you? I'm just trying to protect our family assets." Our family assets. A perfect piece of manipulation. Since when had the house I starved and sacrificed to pay off become a family asset? When I was pulling all-nighters analyzing financial reports, Jason was out partying through college on my money. When I sold my keepsake watch to rescue him from debt, he didn't even call to wish me a happy birthday. And now that his company was teetering on the edge of collapse, suddenly he remembered that we were family. I kept turning pages until I reached the last one. The signature line had already been marked with a bright yellow sticky note. Maya could barely contain herself. She reached into her expensive Dior handbag and pulled out a silver fountain pen. She uncapped it and slid it toward me. "Use mine." "Mom," Maya said, her smile growing stiffer by the second. "The sooner we finish this, the sooner we can enjoy dessert." I looked at the silver pen. Then I looked into Maya's wide, hopeful eyes and at Jason's hands still clamped around the edge of the table. The air in the dining room turned thick. I could hear Jason breathing. They were counting every second, waiting for the moment I lowered the pen to paper. They believed their manipulation had worked. They believed this confused old woman had finally been softened by sweet lies and quiet threats about sickness, decline, and dependency. But what amateur con artists never understand is this: a forensic accountant never believes what she hears. We only believe what we investigate, and I had already investigated every darkest corner of their lives. The moment I reached for that pen was not surrender. It was the opening move in a sentence they would pay for, with their reputations, their future, and every shred of dignity they had left. I refused Maya's silver pen. Instead, I opened my old handbag and took out a pen of my own. I rolled it lightly between my fingers, feeling its weight settle into my hand. "I understand," I said softly. "I know exactly whose future you're doing this for." Then I bent down and placed the tip of my pen against the paper. I twisted open the cap of my fountain pen. The cold, familiar metal pressed against my skin. This was the same pen I had used to sign hundreds of financial audit reports throughout my career at the IRS. But today, the ink inside it was very different. It was a special blue-black ink given to me by an old friend in document forensics, an ink that would completely evaporate and vanish without leaving a single trace on the paper in exactly 24 hours. I carefully lowered the nib onto the final page of the general power of attorney. The faint scratching of pen against paper filled the heavy silence in the dining room. I signed the name Evelyn Pierce in the slowest, clearest, most deliberate script I could manage. The moment I lifted my pen, Jason let out a breath of relief he could no longer hide. Maya's face lit up with a radiant smile. She immediately reached forward and pulled the documents toward herself with a movement so fast it was almost a snatch. Then she cradled the stack of papers in her arms as if it were a winning lottery ticket whose numbers had just been announced. "We'll take care of everything from now on, Mom," Maya said, her voice dripping with sweetness and victory. "You just need to relax and rest. Tomorrow I'll call a real estate agent to come evaluate the house. We need to price it before you move into the nursing home." Jason nodded in agreement. He reached for his wine glass and took a long, confident sip. Every trace of tension had vanished from his face, replaced by the arrogance of a man who believed he had just stolen the crown. They thought that signature had handed them absolute power. They thought they now controlled every piece of my property and could throw me out of my own life without consequence. But what these delusional fools did not know was that the power of attorney had been worthless long before I ever signed it. Even if my signature did not disappear tomorrow, they still would never be able to sell this house. Because 6 months earlier, I had quietly transferred full legal ownership of the property into an anonymous trust. Legally speaking, Evelyn Pierce no longer owned a single piece of real estate for them to seize. I smiled gently as I watched the two of them celebrating across the dinner table. Let them enjoy their illusion of power for a few more days. Because this power of attorney was only bait, and the truly devastating secret I was about to uncover inside Jason's case file was the thing that would really send them to prison. 7 days after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, Jason showed up at my front door without so much as a phone call. It was one of those drizzly December days New Jersey does so well, but my son didn't have a single drop of rain on him. He stepped out of a gleaming Porsche parked arrogantly across the driveway I had spent 20 years shoveling and sweeping with my own hands. He was wearing a smoke-gray cashmere coat that looked more expensive than my monthly grocery budget, and he carried a box of pastries from one of those famous artisan bakeries downtown. An ordinary mother might have been touched by that kind of surprise attention from her busy son, but a former forensic accountant knows that when someone suddenly arrives with a gift, they're usually preparing to take something worth 1,000 times more. I opened the door, invited him inside, and quietly poured him a cup of hot tea. Jason sat down on the sofa in my living room, his eyes drifting over the paintings on the walls and the antique furniture, as if he were silently calculating the value of every single piece. He started with dull small talk about the weather and how exhausted Maya had been in the final months of her pregnancy. I simply sat there sipping my tea and waiting. In financial investigations, the person asking for money is always the one who eventually has to break the silence first. And then right on cue, he began his performance. His voice dropped into a lower register, heavy with fake sincerity and rehearsed helplessness. He said his tech startup was standing at the edge of a massive breakthrough, but investors were temporarily pulling back because of the broader economic downturn. He said he only needed one last push, an internal family investment to keep everything from collapsing. Mom Jason said, leaning toward me with wide, pleading eyes, "I know you have a very large 401k account you haven't touched. You're getting ready to move into Shady Pines anyway. You don't need that much liquid cash anymore. I'm not asking you for money. I'm inviting you to invest in your son's future, and I'll pay you back double once the company goes public." I looked straight into his eyes. That retirement account was the result of 30 years of skipped vacations, worn-out clothes, and so many overtime hours staring at glowing spreadsheets that my eyesight had blurred from the numbers. It was the final safety net of my life, the guarantee that I would never have to depend on anyone. And now he was asking me to throw that one last safety net into the black hole of debt created by his own incompetence and reckless spending. When I didn't answer right away, Jason shifted to emotional manipulation. He sighed, dragged a hand down his face, and performed the part of a man under unbearable pressure. "You don't understand what I'm dealing with, Mom. Maya is pregnant with your first grandchild. She's under extreme stress because she's terrified we'll lose the house if the company goes under. The doctor said stress is bad for the baby. Do you really want your grandchild to be born into crushing debt? Maya even said that if things don't improve, she won't want anyone visiting the baby because she's too ashamed of our situation. You don't want to be banned from seeing your own grandchild just because you're hoarding money in the bank. Do you, Mom?" He was using an unborn child as a hostage to extort me. The son I had spent my youth protecting was now sitting in front of me playing the victim and preparing to blame my supposed cruelty if he failed. I looked at that $1,000 cashmere sweater, and suddenly a memory from 15 years earlier came rushing back with brutal clarity. Jason was 19, then a sophomore at an Ivy League university. One night he called me in a total panic. He and his wealthy friends had thrown a destructive dorm party and severely damaged the school's computer system. The university threatened to expel him and involve the police unless $50,000 was paid immediately. I had just covered his tuition, and I didn't have enough cash left in my account. To save my son's future, I made one of the most painful decisions of my life. I opened an old velvet-lined wooden box and took out the solid gold pocket watch, the only heirloom my late father had ever left me. It was the one thing I had always planned to pass down to the next generation as a symbol of family. I took it to a pawn shop and sold it for far less than it was worth, just so I could wire the money to the school before the deadline. When I called Jason to tell him he was safe, he gave me one distracted thank you, said he was tired, and hung up. He never once asked where I had gotten that kind of money so quickly. He never once noticed that the family watch had disappeared from the cabinet shelf. And now, 15 years later, here he was again demanding that I sacrifice the last of my financial security to rescue him from mistakes created by his own greed. The first time he used his academic future to pressure me. This time he was using my grandchild. The method had changed. The fraud and ingratitude had not. I slowly lifted my teacup to my lips. The tea was warm as it slid down my throat, but inside I felt nothing but ice. A forensic accountant never invests in a business run by someone with a history of deceiving stakeholders. And as a mother, I had permanently closed the charity bank for this son a very long time ago. "You're asking me to sell off the security of my old age to finance a risky business venture, Jason?" I said, my voice calm and stripped of emotion. "That is not an investment. That is a gamble. And I do not gamble with numbers." Jason's face darkened instantly. The obedient, pleading son performance vanished, and his real nature stepped forward. His eyes hardened, his jaw tightened with resentment. He shot to his feet and shoved the pastry box across the coffee table so hard it slid several inches. Then he muttered a stream of bitter accusations about my selfishness and coldness before turning his back and storming out the door without a single glance behind him. But in his rush of anger, he left something behind. His black leather briefcase was still sitting on the sofa, and one of the files inside had fallen slightly open, just enough to expose numbers he never, ever wanted me to see. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through every hallway in the house. I sat motionless in my armchair, listening to the angry roar of Jason's Porsche engine out on the driveway. Its tires ground against the gravel before the car shot off into the pale curtain of rain. Jason was gone. He left in the fury of a con man who had just been denied funding. But in his panic and rage, he had made the most basic mistake every financial criminal makes. He left the evidence behind. His black leather briefcase lay abandoned on the velvet sofa. The metal zipper was half open. A light brown file folder was sticking out from the top, its flap slightly parted, exposing pages densely covered in print. I didn't rush toward it. I was not some nosy mother sneaking a look through her son's private papers. I was a former IRS investigator. I slowly set my now cold cup of Earl Grey down on the table. Then I rose to my feet and carefully walked over to the sofa. I didn't touch the briefcase. Anyone trained in forensic analysis knows you observe the full picture before you ever touch the details. I bent down slightly so the chandelier light could fall directly across the exposed page. In the upper left corner, I could make out part of the logo from one of the largest lenders on the East Coast. Just beneath it was a string of numbers printed in bold. To an ordinary person, they were meaningless. To a forensic eye, they were financial DNA telling the entire story. The first 4 digits identified the branch. The next 2 classified the credit instrument. And I recognized that classification code instantly. It was not a business loan, no matter what nonsense Jason had just tried to sell me. It was the code for an asset-backed mortgage loan, the kind most people call a home equity line of credit. The next line displayed the approved credit limit, a 5 followed by 5 zeros, $500,000. I closed my eyes for 2 seconds and captured the full 12-digit account number in my short-term memory. 30 years of handling complex tax files had trained me to memorize numbers like photographs. I didn't need to pull the paper out of the briefcase. I already had everything I needed. I turned and walked straight into my study at the end of the hallway. That room was my fortress. There were no sentimental family photographs on the desk, only a solid oak work table, a leather chair, and a dual-monitor computer system. I sat down and woke the screens. The only sounds in the room were the low hum of the cooling fans and the steady rhythm of my fingers moving across the keyboard. Unlike confused people who search for answers on ordinary search engines, I went directly to the source data. I activated my encrypted VPN. Then I logged into the county's public records portal where every property transfer and mortgage filing was stored. I didn't search Jason's name. I searched my house. I entered the zip code and parcel number of the home I had fought to pay off 22 years earlier. The progress bar swept across the screen. Blue light from the monitor washed over my face, cold and expressionless. Then the data appeared, and right there on the very first line of the recent transaction history was a brand new debt filing recorded just 4 months earlier. The name of the lender matched the logo I had just seen inside Jason's briefcase. The loan amount matched the $500,000 exactly. And the collateral listed was the very house I was sitting in. But for a bank to approve a mortgage loan like that, they would need the legal owner's signature. They would need mine. I clicked the link to download the digital copy of the original loan file. Page after page appeared on the screen in crisp detail. Contract terms, interest rate, payment schedule. I scrolled straight to the final page, the page with the legal signatures, and that was when I saw it. Evelyn Pierce. My signature sat neatly across the dotted line. It had been signed in blue ink, elegant and smooth. To anyone else it would have looked real. An outsider would have sworn it was mine, but I was the one who had created that signature. I knew the angle of my lowercase e. I knew the pressure I used on the P. The signature on the screen was too stiff in the tailstroke. It lacked the natural glide of a woman who had signed her own name thousands of times. It was a forgery, a very sophisticated forgery, but still a forgery. Jason had forged my signature. He had pulled some dirty notary or corrupt loan officer into the scheme to validate the file. He had taken $500,000 against the value of my home and pumped that money straight into his polished little FOD. Maya's designer spending, his brand new Porsche. All of it had been funded by an act of federal financial fraud. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't cry. I didn't feel my heart break. I felt something far colder than heartbreak. I felt absolute stillness, a deadly stillness. The son I had carried inside my body and raised with my own hands had officially crossed the line from ungrateful child to criminal offender. He had signed the death warrant for his own future. I reached for the mouse and clicked the printer icon in the corner of the screen. In the corner of the room, the laser printer came to life, spitting out page after page of hard evidence. I gathered the documents and clipped them neatly into a folder. The game had changed. He wanted to steal my property, but I was about to take something far more valuable. I was going to take his freedom. I sat perfectly still in front of the computer screen, pale blue light washing across my frozen face. $500,000, $500,000 had been ripped out of the value of the house I had spent my youth and my health protecting. I slowly reached for the stack of documents the printer had just released, the ink still warm on the pages. My forged signature sat there on the final sheet like a slap across my face. But I did not cry. Tears are for mothers who are merely wounded. And at that moment, I was no longer only a mother. I was a forensic accountant staring at the scene of a federal crime. I laid the file down on the oak desk. My right hand began tapping against the wood. One beat at a time, slow, steady. The sound of my fingers striking the desk echoed dryly through the silent room. With every tap, another piece of the truth slid into its proper place. First beat. Jason had hired a corrupt notary or mortgage broker to authenticate that forged signature. Second beat. That $500,000 had never gone into any startup company. Third beat. It had been funneled straight into a personal account to pay for the luxury car parked outside and the ridiculous designer garbage his vulgar wife had been draping all over herself. The rage inside me did not explode into screaming or shattered glass. It rose in silence and hardened into something enormous, sharp, and cold. This betrayal had gone far beyond family and gratitude. This was financial fraud. This was forgery. This was wire fraud. The son I had raised did not merely want to shove me into a nursing home so he could take over my space. He had already stolen from me. He had already placed my entire future at risk. If that loan went unpaid and the bank foreclosed, I would lose everything. My tapping stopped. I drew in one deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs and clearing my mind more completely than ever before. Jason thought he was smarter than I was. He thought a 62-year-old woman would never know how to access the county portal and pull mortgage records. He had underestimated the woman who had spent her entire life exposing the most sophisticated schemes wealthy men could devise. I carefully stacked the papers into a neat file. I was not going to call him and scream. I was not going to give him the chance to lie, explain, or destroy evidence. I was going to cast the largest net of my entire career. I locked the documents inside the most secure drawer in my desk. Each metallic click of the lock sounded like the closing of a jail cell. I had forgiven Jason many times before. The time he lied to get spending money, the time he caused that disaster at university. But a mother's forgiveness had officially run dry. The man who had just walked out of my house was no longer my son. He was a criminal, and I knew exactly what I had to do next to make sure that criminal paid the highest possible price for every last cent he had mercilessly stolen from me. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 11, its chimes echoing through the house. I was still sitting in my study, the drawer containing Jason's criminal evidence locked tight, when the doorbell suddenly shattered the silence. One long, urgent ring tore through the late-night stillness. An ordinary person might have felt a jolt of fear hearing someone at the door at that hour. But in the world of financial fraud, midnight visitors usually arrive carrying the darkest secrets of all, secrets they never want exposed in the light of day. I stepped into the hallway, switched on the porch light, and turned the doorknob. The December rain was still falling in a cold, steady drizzle. Standing beneath the weak yellow glow on my front steps was Richard, my ex-husband. It had been 2 years since he packed up and walked out of this house to chase after a 35-year-old mistress. Tonight, He was wearing an expensive coat, but the collar sat crooked on his neck, and I could smell the sickly sweet scent of cheap perfume rising from his scarf. His wrinkled face twisted itself into a half-smile filled with condescension and fake sympathy. But he wasn't alone. Standing directly behind him was a stranger in a windbreaker with the logo of a property appraisal company on the chest. He was holding a tablet in one hand and a laser measuring tool in the other. "Sorry to disturb you this late, Evelyn," Richard said, his thick voice breaking the silence. "But our schedule is a little tight. This is Mr. Miller, an independent real estate appraiser. Jason called me and said you've been having some difficulty managing the property. He asked me to come help finalize the reappraisal before you officially move into the nursing home. We only need 15 minutes to measure a few of the main rooms." I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance, my eyes shifting from the appraiser to Richard's smug face. In less than a quarter of a second, my forensic mind locked every piece into place. My fraudulent son had done more than forge my signature. He had secretly joined forces with my worthless ex-husband. They had formed a filthy little alliance. Jason needed more money to cover up the collapse. Richard wanted to reopen the divorce battlefield and snatch the last remaining value out of the house before they pushed me out for good. They had already planned how to divide the labor of my entire life right in front of me. Richard took one step forward, trying to push his way inside as if he still owned this home. He thought a 62-year-old woman living alone would tremble and step aside before the pressure of two grown men. He thought I would quietly let them measure the cage they were preparing for me. I looked straight into his aging, greedy eyes. Then I slowly stepped back and let them walk into the light of the living room. Let them measure. Let them appraise. Because what they did not know was this: they were not measuring my house. They were measuring the dimensions of their own financial grave. I stepped aside and let the two men cross the threshold. The smell of cheap cologne mixed with the damp mildew of rain-soaked coats instantly filled my living room. Richard peeled off his wet overcoat and tossed it carelessly onto the linen armchair I had washed with my own hands just yesterday. The appraiser didn't even bother to nod in greeting. He simply pulled a laser measuring device from his pocket and began casting sharp red beams across my solid oak-paneled walls. Richard moved to the center of the room, hands on his hips, letting his eyes roam over my furniture as if he were strolling through a second-hand shop preparing to bargain for the whole place. It had been 2 years since the day he dragged his suitcase out of this house to chase a mistress nearly 30 years younger than him. Tonight he looked far older and more worn down than I had expected. His badly dyed black hair exposed pale silver roots beneath the crystal chandelier. The gold-plated watch on his wrist reflected a gaudy, vulgar shine that clashed with the suit he was trying so hard to make look expensive. The luxury he had draped over himself was nothing but a thin costume hiding the financial collapse rotting underneath. "It must feel a little lonely living here all by yourself, Evelyn." Richard began, his tone soaked in condescension and fake sympathy. "This house is too large, too demanding for a woman your age. Jason called me this morning. The boy is worried. Terrified, actually. He says you've started showing serious signs of confusion lately and that you can't even manage your own bills anymore. As his father, I can't just stand by and watch this family fall into chaos because of your stubborn pride." I didn't answer him. I simply folded my arms and calmly watched his pathetic little performance. When a traitor who once abandoned you suddenly returns talking about family responsibility, you can be absolutely certain he is already reaching for your wallet. Richard walked toward the fireplace and lightly patted the marble mantel with the hand wearing that thick gold ring. "Actually, I'm not here tonight just because of Jason." His voice dropped, turning colder, sharper, more threatening. "I had my new attorney review our divorce settlement from 2 years ago. He discovered that you were not entirely transparent about your retirement accounts and the valuation of this property. You were a forensic accountant after all. You know exactly how to hide. Numbers mislead a court and make a fool out of a man like me, don't you?" He smoothed the front of his suit jacket and smiled, like a man convinced he held every advantage. "My lawyer says we have strong legal grounds to reopen the divorce case. I'm entitled to half of the current market value of this house. And if we end up in court, I'm afraid those medical reports Jason has been gathering about your memory issues won't help you at all. No judge is going to side with a senile old woman who is clearly trying to hide assets and rob her son and ex-husband of what they deserve. The threats rolled off his tongue too smoothly, as if he had stood in front of a mirror, rehearsing them for days. He wanted me to believe I had been cornered, that there was no way out. He and my ungrateful son had officially formed a filthy alliance. Jason needed cash desperately to keep his collapsing company alive and cover up that forged $500,000 mortgage loan. Richard, meanwhile, was starving for a large payout to keep financing his ridiculous fantasy life with his young mistress. Together, they had decided to weaponize a fabricated story about my mental decline. They wanted to force the sale of my house hand, half the money to Richard, and place the rest under Jason's control. "Look at me, Evelyn," Richard said, spreading his arms wide, his voice swelling with arrogance and self-satisfaction. "I'm living the best months of my life. Chloe, my fiancée, is only 35. She's young, vibrant, full of life. She doesn't nag me about bills or force me to sit through those dry, boring financial reports of yours. We're planning to buy a luxury condo in Miami so we can spend the winters by the beach. And you're rotting away in this outdated house, clinging to family memories that don't even exist anymore. Face reality. Your time is over. The smartest thing you can do now is cooperate, sign the sale papers, and move into a proper nursing facility. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." I looked at the man I had spent 30 years married to, now standing in the middle of my living room insulting me inside a home I had furnished piece by piece with my own money. He called me old. He called me withered. He bragged about his younger mistress and his glamorous future in Miami. But through the cold eyes of a seasoned financial investigator, I saw only a desperate man thrashing to keep from drowning. A thin layer of sweat glistened across his forehead, even though the night outside was freezing. His eyes kept flicking toward the appraiser as if silently urging him to move faster. He was in serious financial trouble. That young mistress was almost certainly draining the last dollars out of his accounts, and he needed the value of this house like a man clutching for his final life raft. I stood there listening to the appraiser's heavy footsteps pounding across the polished wood floors. I heard the laser device beep again and again as it recorded the dimensions of each bedroom, each wall, each corner of the kitchen. They were smug, certain. They believed they were casting a net so wide and tight that I could never escape it. They believed that the combined force of a greedy ex-husband and a ruthless, fraudulent son would be enough to make a 62-year-old woman living alone collapse in fear and beg for mercy. But they had no idea that the house they were measuring so eagerly in the middle of the night no longer belonged to me. They did not know that the divorce file Richard was so eager to reopen contained copies of his own offshore shell company tax records I had quietly preserved years ago. And they most certainly did not know that just 1 hour before they rang my bell, I had already secured the full evidence of Jason's forged signature. I was not the one being cornered. I was the one slowly locking the door, throwing away the key, and trapping every predator in the steel cage I had built with my own hands. While Richard's ridiculous appraiser was sweeping red laser beams across my living room, the front door swung open again. This time, it was Maya. My precious daughter-in-law stepped inside, wearing a designer silk dress cut far too boldly for the bitter cold of December, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. But the most striking thing about her was not the outfit. It was the smartphone clutched tightly in her hand, with its bright ring light blazing straight ahead. She was live streaming. A perfectly manufactured smile so polished it looked industrial was glued to her carefully painted face. "Hello, my angels," Maya sang into the camera in that sugary voice of hers, sweet enough to make your skin crawl. "Tonight is a really difficult night for our family. Jason and I are here at my mother-in-law's house, trying to help her get a few things settled so she can have some stability. Her mental condition has been declining very quickly lately. She's forgetful, paranoid, and often becomes agitated. Please keep our family in your prayers." Her camera slowly swept around the living room before stopping directly on my face. Then she stepped closer, very close. She was building a trap. She wanted me angry. She wanted me to slap her hand away, smash the phone, or scream something vicious into that glowing lens. Any loss of control from me in that moment would become gold-plated evidence she and my fraudulent son could drag into court to prove that I was some unstable old woman in urgent need of guardianship. But I had spent 30 years of my life sitting across from the most practiced liars on earth. I do not let amateurs manipulate my emotions. I completely ignored the red, blinking lens pointed at me. Then I slowly turned my back and walked one calm step at a time into my marble kitchen. I opened the oak cabinet above the sink and carefully removed my English bone china teapot, an elegant antique I had bought for myself 10 years earlier after closing a major tax fraud case. "See?" Maya kept following behind me, her voice trembling on purpose, as though she were suffering some unbearable heartbreak. "She's completely ignoring me." "Mom, do you even know what time it is right now? Do you even remember why everyone had to gather here in the middle of the night?" I switched on the electric kettle. The water began to hum softly in the silence. I opened the tea tin and took out a measured pinch of fine Earl Grey. The refined fragrance of bergamot and black tea spread through the kitchen at once, cutting through the cheap perfume lingering in the air. I warmed the teapot with a little boiling water, a small ritual of precision and grace that I repeated every day. Then I let the tea leaves fall into the pot and poured in the hot water, watching them swirl and bloom. Maya was clearly growing irritated by my silence. She stepped closer and shoved the phone almost against my shoulder. "Stop pretending you can't hear me, Evelyn," she snapped. "We're trying to help you. The doctor said your confusion is only going to get worse if you keep insisting on living alone in this giant house. You're becoming a danger to yourself." I slowly placed the lid onto the teapot. Then I picked up a clean linen cloth and gently dried the few droplets that had fallen onto the marble counter. Only when everything was perfectly in place did I turn around. I looked straight into Maya's flashing camera lens, then lifted my eyes to her face. That face so desperately trying to play the victim. And I smiled. A smile so gentle it might have looked merciful, but as cold as a surgeon's blade. "I remember everything very clearly, Maya," I said, my voice calm, level, and crisp with every word. "I remember that today is December 12th. And I also remember very clearly that the designer handbag hanging from your shoulder cost $15,000, a staggering amount of money. Your pitiful little income from filming yourself eating could never possibly afford." I tilted my head slightly and looked deeper into her lens, as if I were speaking directly to her followers. "Hello to everyone watching my daughter-in-law's show. You're looking at a woman who loves to present herself as living a perfect life full of luxury labels and glamorous vacations. But have any of you ever stopped to ask where that money comes from? Especially when her husband's company is teetering on the edge of collapse and her credit cards keep getting declined at department stores." Maya's jaw locked. Her false lashes fluttered wildly with panic. She stumbled back a step, trying to pull the phone away from my calm face. "What are you even talking about?" Maya stammered, her high-pitched voice beginning to crack apart. "My mother-in-law has been imagining cruel things lately, everyone. She can't control what she says." I poured the tea from the porcelain pot into a small, gold-rimmed cup. Warm, fragrant steam rose into the air. I lifted the cup to my lips and blew lightly across the surface. "You don't need to worry about my self-control," I said softly, each word landing directly on the raw nerve of her fake pride. "I'm a forensic accountant. I never imagine things. I read numbers, and numbers always tell a very honest story. They tell stories about incompetent people who survive by feeding off other people's assets while preaching success and morality online." The hand holding Maya's phone began to shake violently. She realized at last that her little video trap had completely backfired. Instead of capturing a hysterical old mother-in-law, she was live-streaming the public humiliation of her own pathetic performance to thousands of viewers. My composure had crushed her cheap psychological script into dust. Her face turned pale beneath the contour powder. Her fingers fumbled frantically across the screen until she finally stabbed the button to end the live stream. The phone screen went black. The kitchen returned to silence, broken only by the ticking clock and Maya's furious, ragged breathing. I took a slow sip of Earl Grey and let the bitter elegance of it settle on my tongue. "What an interesting evening," I said, setting the cup down on its saucer with one clean, sharp click. "Next time you decide to direct a tragedy, make sure you don't choose the wrong woman as your opponent. And now take your cheap little camera out of my kitchen before I call the police and let them deal with your invasion of privacy." I sat quietly and took another slow sip of tea. My eyes did not rest on Maya's face, now pale with fury. Instead, they drifted downward to the handbag hanging from her shoulder. It was a limited edition black crocodile leather Dior bag, its gold-plated hardware glinting beneath the ceiling light. I knew that bag very well because just last month I had happened to read a financial report on luxury spending trends. Its retail price was no less than $15,000. The mind of a forensic accountant never stops working. It is like a machine that automatically analyzes every stream of money moving back and forth in front of it. A startup teetering on the edge of collapse cannot afford to pay its CEO some enormous salary. A social media account with pitiful engagement cannot generate $15,000 in disposable income for a single handbag. And an ex-husband who is busy hiding assets to avoid financial obligations cannot generously bankroll his daughter-in-law's designer fantasies. So where did the money come from? The answer was sitting neatly inside the locked drawer in my study, the $500,000 home equity loan. The pieces fit together so perfectly, it was chilling. Jason had used my forged signature to borrow money from the bank. That $500,000 had been deposited into his account and then immediately bled dry without mercy. They had not used it to save the company, despite all the desperate pleading and emotional blackmail he had thrown at me. They used it to buy the newest Porsche now parked in my driveway, and the Dior handbag perched so proudly on the shoulder of my ridiculous daughter-in-law. This was no longer an ordinary family property dispute. A massive sum of money had moved across state lines through the electronic banking system, all based on a forged signature. Under federal law, that was wire fraud and financial document forgery. Without even realizing it, they had stepped out of a cheap little family drama and straight into a federal criminal case carrying the possibility of decades in prison. I lifted my eyes and looked at Maya and Richard. They were still standing there staring at me with that mix of pity and smug triumph. They thought they were deceiving a confused old woman who knew nothing about how modern money worked. But what they did not know was that every luxury item they were wearing at that very moment had already become some of the sharpest pieces of evidence the Financial Crimes Unit would one day seize. Every click of Maya's high heels, every roar of Jason's Porsche engine, each one was counting down the seconds until they were driven straight toward prison. I gave a faint smile and set my teacup gently back onto the saucer. The flow of funds statement in my mind was complete. Richard gave a dry, sharp clap, signaling the appraiser to pack up his equipment. Their little midnight inspection was over. He slipped his rain-soaked coat back on, smoothed the collar with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just closed a very profitable deal. Maya quickly tucked her phone back into that absurdly expensive Dior handbag of hers. Her face still carried the bitterness of being exposed by me, but her eyes could not hide the greed as they swept over the paintings on the walls and the antique furniture in the room. "We're giving you exactly 1 month, Evelyn," Richard said in that arrogant, patronizing tone of his as he reached the front door. 30 days is more than enough time for you to pack up your old personal things and find yourself a small room in a nursing home. On the 12th of next month, my lawyer and Jason will bring over the asset management papers. Don't try to make this complicated or resist for no reason. You don't have the money to hire a top lawyer, and you certainly don't have the mental strength to represent yourself in court. Accept reality. Maya slipped her arm through her father-in-law's and lifted her chin at me with that polished, artificial smile she always wore. "Well, send you a list of nursing homes that accept basic health insurance, Mom. Just relax and rest. We'll take very good care of this house." I stood with my arms folded, leaning back against the wall, watching them walk out of my home. I did not respond to a single threat or mocking remark. I simply gave the faintest, calmest nod. Then the front door slammed shut. A moment later, the roar of an expensive engine tore through the midnight rain as they drove away into the darkness. They left carrying the illusion of total victory. They believed those 30 days were a death sentence for my freedom. But what they did not know was this. Those 30 days were nothing more than a grace period I was allowing them to enjoy their final breaths of freedom. I walked back into my study. The silence around me was so complete I could hear the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I unlocked the drawer in my oak desk, took out the file stuffed with fraud evidence, and pulled out my cell phone. I did not call a family lawyer. Instead, I dialed a number I had kept carefully stored for 10 years. The line rang twice before a warm, steady, deeply professional male voice answered. "Agent Vance speaking." "Good evening, Marcus," I said calmly. "I hope you haven't forgotten the old professor who taught you fraudulent funds flow investigations at Georgetown." There was a brief pause on the line, thick with respect. "Ms. Pierce," he said, "how could I ever forget the woman who taught me how to smell dirty money before it even hit the ledger? What can I do for you?" I smiled, my eyes fixed on the forged signature lying on the desk in front of me. "I have a federal wire fraud case and a falsified loan file worth $500,000. On top of that, I have the complete tax evasion records of an offshore shell company. I know your economic crimes unit has a real appetite for money laundering networks like this. At the end of the month, my son is hosting a very large charity fundraiser right here on my property. Would you and your colleagues like to attend the party?" I let the silence breathe for one cold, deliberate second. "We have a few honored guests who deserve to be fitted with handcuffs right in front of the cameras." 30 days after that stormy night, my backyard had been transformed into the most ridiculous stage production I had ever witnessed. Jason and Maya had hired a full professional event team to erect a massive white silk pavilion right on the lawn I had spent 20 years shoveling snow from and tending with my own hands. Expensive crystal chandeliers hung suspended overhead, pouring golden light across a red carpet that stretched from the porch steps all the way to the open bar. Tonight was their grand charity fundraiser, a lavish spectacle promoted across every social media platform to polish the upper-class image they were desperately trying to maintain. More than 100 guests were gathered in my garden. Most of them were fake tech investors, self-proclaimed successful entrepreneurs, and of course Maya's collection of online socialite friends. Not a single one of them knew who I was. I wore a simple, elegant navy silk dress, the kind of dress an older woman wears when she has no desire to be noticed. I stood quietly in the shadows near the hydrangea bed, a glass of mineral water in my hand, and began doing what the best forensic accountants always do. I priced the party. My eyes moved over the catering station. $40,000 for the professional chefs serving trays of grilled Maine lobster and premium caviar. Then I looked toward the small performance stage built with polished oak flooring. $15,000 for the chamber orchestra serenading the crowd with soft classical music, and at least $20,000 more for the imported white orchids woven around the trees and draped along the garden path. Every bit of that shimmering luxury, every dazzling light, every bottle of expensive wine flowing through that garden had been paid for with $500,000 taken from a mortgage loan built on my forged signature. They were throwing a celebration on stolen money. At the center of the attention, Maya was busily performing the role of a great philanthropist and perfect mother. She wore a custom ivory silk gown that clung to her growing pregnant belly. Around her swarmed a full camera crew flashes firing non-stop to capture every smile, every graceful wave, every tender gesture as she touched her stomach. I overheard her loudly telling a group of women dripping in diamonds how her charity foundation would support lonely elderly people and homeless children. She preached compassion and sacrifice while plotting to throw her own mother-in-law out of her house and steal every asset she had. Her makeup was flawless enough that no one could see the rot and bottomless greed festering underneath. Not far away, Jason was no less busy. My fraudulent son was dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo, a glass of liquor in his hand, constantly clinking drinks with men in expensive suits. He was performing the role of the brilliant young tech executive, the visionary leader guiding his startup toward dazzling success. He rambled on about multi-million-dollar projects changing the world and enormous profits waiting just over the horizon. He laughed loudly, slapped potential investors on the back, and carried himself like a man completely in control. Every so often he would glance in my direction with a warning in his eyes, as if reminding me to stay silent and not ruin his performance. Not one of those glamorous guests standing on my lawn knew that the young executive's startup was drowning in debt and heading straight for bankruptcy. Not one of them knew that his tuxedo and Maya's silk gown were both evidence in a federal financial fraud case. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to build a stage as grand and radiant as possible and invited everyone they longed to impress. They wanted this event to prove their status, to show the world that they were the winners, and I was just some pathetic burden waiting to be cleared out of their lives. I stood silently beneath the cover of the trees, letting the camera flashes burst and the fake laughter ripple around me. In financial investigations, the most basic rule is this: you let the fraudsters feel completely safe before you slam the cell door shut. The higher they climb, the more devastating the fall. The grander the stage, the louder the audience, the more thunderous the humiliation will be when the blow finally lands. I took a slow sip of my tasteless mineral water and swept my gaze across the garden one last time. Tonight was not just a charity gala. Tonight was judgment night for a mother who had been pushed to the edge, and I had already prepared a death ledger to serve to every last one of them, in the very center of their illusion. The clinking of forks against porcelain plates and the low murmur of more than 100 guests suddenly fell silent when Jason stepped onto the oak platform in the center of the garden. My fraudulent son stood beneath the glittering crystal lights and tapped a finger lightly against the microphone to command attention. He wore a carefully rehearsed smile, the kind meant to project the confidence of a successful tech executive. He began his speech with the usual empty lines about vision innovation and the grand future his company was supposedly building. Below him, the fake investors nodded in approval, champagne flutes lifted high in the middle of all that manufactured glamour. But then the mood of the party shifted. Jason lowered his voice. The bright smile faded from his lips, replaced by an expression of sorrow and gravity. He wrapped both hands around the microphone stand and drew in a deep breath, as if he were about to reveal some deeply buried pain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jason said, his voice thick with carefully staged emotion. "Tonight we've spoken so much about the future, but I cannot stand here without acknowledging the past. Building a startup is a lonely journey, but I have always had a strong foundation behind me. That foundation was my mother, Evelyn Pierce, who is standing right there in the corner of the garden tonight. A spotlight suddenly swung across the lawn and landed directly on the shadowed corner where I had been standing. The camera crew Maya had hired immediately turned their lenses toward me. More than 100 faces turned in unison. I stood perfectly still in my plain navy silk dress, one hand loosely holding a glass of mineral water. I did not blink. I did not step back from the brutal flood of light. Jason continued his vile little performance. "These past months have been an incredibly painful time for our family. My mother, the strong woman who raised me, is now battling severe cognitive decline. This cruel condition is slowly stealing her clarity, leaving her confused and paranoid more and more often. She gave her whole life to this family, and now it is time for her to rest. That is why our family has made the heartbreaking but necessary decision for her to step away from all financial responsibilities, move into a specialized care facility, and transfer full management of this estate to me so I can preserve our family legacy." A soft wave of pity rippled through the crowd. Whispers spread across the lawn. "How sad. She looks so frail. How lucky she is to have such a devoted son willing to carry this burden." I heard every word. I saw every expression soaked in false sympathy from people who had no idea who I really was. In the front row, Maya lifted a hand to dab at an invisible tear in the corner of her eye, carefully displaying the diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist. A little farther back, Richard nodded solemnly, fully committed to the role of the noble ex-husband, grieving over the tragic decline of his former wife. Any other 62-year-old woman dragged into the spotlight and publicly humiliated by her own child in front of hundreds of guests might have shattered in that moment. She might have cried out, defended herself, or fled the blinding lights in complete disgrace. But I was not some fragile mother. I was a forensic accountant, and a forensic accountant never responds emotionally to a false report. She analyzes it. So I stood there in silence, as still as a statue carved from ice. I looked straight into Jason's eyes from 15 meters away. Under the stage lights, I could see the cowardice trembling beneath his polished confidence. His jaw was tight. The hand gripping the microphone was shaking slightly. He kept swallowing hard. He was afraid. He was trying to use the weight of the crowd and the presence of the cameras to pin me into the corner of a helpless madwoman. He believed public humiliation would suffocate any thought of resistance and bury me so deeply in shame that I would never dare lift my head again. I let the pity of 100 strangers rain down on me. I felt every condescending glance, every whisper, every judgment. They were nothing but dry wood being piled higher onto the fire burning inside me. Jason wanted to turn me into a senile mental patient so he could justify stealing my property and bury the truth about the forged $500,000 mortgage loan. He wanted Maya's tears and Richard's support to hammer the final nail into the coffin of my freedom. But his performance had reached its final act. I slowly turned the glass in my hand and watched the light flash across its surface. I did not need to scream to prove I was sane. I did not need to explain to this crowd of counterfeit guests that I was the woman who had paid for every brick of this house. All I had to do was wait. Wait for the moment their triumph reached its highest point. And when the applause began to thunder across the lawn for Jason's fake devotion, I smiled, a very faint smile, calm, measured. It was time for the velvet curtain of deception to come down, top of form, bottom of form. Applause exploded across the garden. It was a harsh, rattling sound, hundreds of hands praising a perfectly staged lie. More than 100 counterfeit socialites were staring at my son with admiration, then turning to me with eyes soaked in pity. They whispered among themselves about the poor old woman who was losing her memory, her dignity, and her fortune all at once. They believed every sweet, poisonous lie Jason had just fed them from that stage. They believed he was the hero. I stood motionless beneath the crystal lights, the cold glow spilling over my navy silk dress. I did not bow my head. I did not cry. I let every look of sympathy fall on me like ash. And in that razor-thin moment of stillness, surrounded by all that noise, my mind drifted back to the first day I walked into the investigations office at the IRS 30 years earlier. I remembered the oath my mentor spoke to me when I received my credentials. He told me that people will always lie. They will cry. They will swear innocence. They will manipulate, distort, and perform every emotional trick they can to hide their greed. But numbers do not. Numbers are pure, cold, emotionless, and absolutely honest. For 30 years, I had carried that belief like a blade through every case I ever touched. I had exposed massive corporations using charity fronts to launder dirty money. I had sent arrogant billionaires to prison with nothing more than a discarded bank statement found in a trash bin. I had learned how to look through expensive suits, luxury cars, and polished speeches about morality and vision and find the rot buried underneath the balance sheets. And tonight, in the very garden I had spent half my life tending with my own hands, I was being forced to use those same skills on the people who shared my blood. I looked at Jason standing on that raised wooden platform. His face relaxed into a smug, satisfied smile. He thought that speech had been the final blow. He thought this crowd was a fortress strong enough to protect him from the truth. Then I shifted my eyes to Maya. She was lifting her fingers to dab away a tear that did not exist from a cheek layered in expensive powder, her victorious eyes flicking in my direction. Farther back, Richard stood, nodding solemnly, raising his red wine like some noble, compassionate man. Together they had woven a net of lies so large it was meant to bury me inside it, strip me of my name, steal my dignity, turn me into a ghost inside my own home. But they had forgotten one essential thing. They were trying to use emotion to defeat a data analyst. I could feel the weight of the cold metal USB drive tucked inside the pocket of my light coat. It did not contain sentimental family photos or warm little home videos. It contained hundreds of pages of carefully encrypted PDF files. It contained the forged mortgage loan documents bearing my fake signature. It contained the wire transfer history showing the money flowing straight from the bank into the accounts of Portia and Dior. It contained Richard's full offshore tax evasion records in the Cayman Islands. Those were not just digital files. They were legal explosives. Every one of them had already been armed. All they needed now was a spark. My heartbeat remained steady at 70 beats per minute. My breathing was deep and even. There was no fear in me, no confusion, no panic, only clarity, sharp and absolute. Truth does not need to scream to be heard. Truth only needs to be presented at the right moment in the right place. And there was no more perfect moment than this one when their arrogance was hovering at its highest point. The fall from the peak of deception is always the most brutal, the most complete, the most unforgettable. The applause began to thin. Jason smiled and dipped his head to the crowd one more time, his hand relaxing on the microphone stand as he prepared to step away and return the stage to the orchestra. That was the moment. 0 hour had arrived. I set my glass of mineral water down on the marble table beside me. The soft click disappeared beneath the noise of the party, but to me it sounded like the opening gunshot. I slowly lifted my chin, my shoulders straightened, and I placed a gentle, harmless smile on my lips, the kind of smile people expect from an old woman surrendering to fate. Then I stepped out from the shadows of the hydrangea trees. My steps were slow, but unwavering. The crowd began to notice me moving. A few guests hurried backward to make room, their faces still full of pity for the confused old woman they thought they understood. I walked between two lines of wealthy guests, passing through the cloud of expensive perfume, and murmured whispers. Maya realized I was heading for the stage, and the smile on her lips stiffened, but she did not dare step forward and stop me in front of hundreds of witnesses. Richard frowned, his old eyes narrowing with suspicion. I climbed the wooden steps and walked straight toward the podium where Jason had frozen in place. My son's face changed instantly. The confidence vanished from his eyes. In its place came a flash of panic, fast, sharp, impossible to hide. He had never imagined I would dare walk up there. He thought I would collapse in some dark corner and disappear quietly. I stopped in front of him, only one step away. "Thank you, my son," I said, my voice low, warm, and so clear that every word cut through the night. "Thank you for those very heartfelt words." I extended my hand and smiled directly into his violently shifting eyes. "Let me borrow the microphone for a moment, Jason. I think as the woman being honored tonight, I should also have a small gift to share with everyone, a little gift to repay the extraordinary devotion of you and my daughter-in-law." I did not wait for his permission. I gently pulled the microphone from his stiff, frozen hand. Then I turned to face the crowd below, the crystal lights pouring down over my calm face. A total silence fell across the entire garden. The velvet curtain had finally been pulled open, and the audit of their lies had officially begun. I held the microphone in my hand, feeling the cold metal seep into my fingertips. Below the stage, hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, waiting for the tearful speech of a frail old mother preparing to quietly fade out of social life. Jason stood right beside me, the smile on his lips frozen into something stiff and unnatural. He couldn't snatch the microphone back in front of the press. All he could do was stand there and hope I would keep performing the tragic little play he had just directed. "Thank you, Jason, for those incredibly heartfelt words," I said, my voice ringing through the expensive speaker system and carrying across the silent garden. "Standing here tonight in front of all these distinguished guests, I am truly moved by the devotion my children have shown me. They have worried about my health. They have thoughtfully selected a nursing home for my final years. They have even offered to take over the entire financial burden of this family. Such a noble sacrifice could never be repaid with a simple thank you alone." I paused for one measured beat, my eyes drifting across Maya's face as the color slowly drained from it, then to the confused frown tightening on Richard's forehead. A murmur spread through the crowd below. They thought I was actually about to hand over my fortune to my son right there on the stage. So I continued. "That is why I too have prepared a very special gift for my children on this wonderful evening. a short film that captures the full truth about the remarkable accomplishments they have achieved in recent months, so that all of the investors, all of their dear friends gathered here tonight can finally see exactly who they are and how they built this beautiful little empire. I turned and gave a small nod to the technician standing at the sound control table. He obediently plugged the storage device I had handed him earlier into the computer. A sharp electronic beep pierced the silence. At once, every crystal chandelier in the garden went dark. The entire party fell into shadow, leaving only the flickering light of the massive projection screen towering behind us. Jason let out a breath of relief. He thought I had surrendered completely. He thought I was about to play sentimental family photos and childhood memories to praise him in front of the crowd. But when the screen blazed to life, there was no soft music, no smiling family portraits, no loving montage. Instead, a massive spreadsheet filled the screen from edge to edge. Rows of financial data highlighted in violent red stretched downward like bloodstains across a white surface. Beside the spreadsheet were crisp, scanned copies of concealed income tax filings and falsified mortgage loan documents. In the upper right corner, the emblem of the Federal Tax Authority appeared in sharp detail, alongside bank account identifiers tied to money quietly funneled offshore. The sympathetic whispers from the audience instantly transformed into sharp gasps of shock. A few investors in the front row stepped forward, squinting as they tried to read the fraudulent figures now exposed in public. Jason spun around and stared at the screen. Every last drop of color vanished from his face. The glass in Maya's hand slipped loose, crashed onto the wooden floor, and shattered with a piercing crack. The curtain of deception had officially been ripped apart, and now the numbers were finally ready to speak judgment. The projector screen behind me cast a cold, merciless light over every stunned face in the crowd below. I lifted my hand and pointed to the first column of data on the Excel sheet, a column highlighted in bright yellow labeled County Property Ownership Records. I'd like to begin this little gift with my beloved daughter-in-law, Maya. I said, my voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade. I looked straight at Maya. She stood frozen in place, shards of broken glass scattered at her feet. The saintly expression of a charitable socialite had vanished completely. In its place was the naked terror of a gold digger whose mask had just been ripped off. Do you remember Maya on Thanksgiving night when you sat at my dining table and told me you wanted to tear down the wall in my master bedroom to build a studio for your social media videos? You said this house was far too large for a confused old woman. You said you needed the space to grow your personal brand. You even made a list of the new furniture you planned to buy with my money. I took one slow step forward, never taking my eyes off her. But my dear daughter-in-law, there is one basic rule of business that your little world of fake likes and hollow followers has clearly never taught you. I let the silence hang for half a second. You cannot renovate a property you do not own, and you certainly cannot throw the rightful owner out of her own house with a worthless power of attorney form. I motioned for the technician to switch to the second document. A scanned copy of the property deed appeared in crisp detail on the giant screen. Everyone could now see the bold line identifying the legal owner. That name is not mine, I said. I have not personally owned this house for 6 months. The moment I noticed the disturbing way Jason and you had begun spending money, I quietly formed a limited liability company called Phoenix LLC. Then I transferred full ownership of this house and the beautiful 2 acres of land we are all standing on tonight into that company. A wave of murmuring swept through the crowd. Jason's fake investors started leaning forward, reading the legal language on the screen with new panic in their eyes. Maya's mouth fell open. Her gaze darted wildly from my face to the blood-red numbers blazing behind me. She tried to say something, but her throat had locked shut. And do you know the most wonderful thing about an LLC, Maya? I continued, my voice measured and even, like I was delivering an audit report before a board of directors. Its sole manager, that would be me, has full authority to buy, sell, or transfer its assets without requiring permission, consent, or signatures from grasping little relatives. I paused just long enough for the next blow to land. The house you were planning to steal, the house you used as the stage for this ridiculous, vulgar little gala, was sold outright to a commercial real estate developer yesterday morning. This time, the silence cracked. Maya stumbled backward, the heel of her designer shoe grinding against a shard of broken glass with a harsh scraping sound. Both hands flew to the silk-covered curve of her pregnant belly. Her whole body shook like a dry leaf in a storm. She turned toward Jason, desperate for rescue. But Jason stood on that stage like a statue, unable to produce a single word. They had just lost the biggest gold mine of their lives. "The deposit has already been transferred directly into my irrevocable trust," I said, my voice hardening for the final strike. "The legal transfer is complete, which means that at this very moment, every one of you is standing, drinking, filming, and pretending to be important on land that now belongs to a private development corporation." I swept my eyes across the garden, and they are planning to level this entire property to build a luxury condominium complex. You have no right to stand here. You have no right to tear down so much as a single wall. Maya began gasping for air. Sweat broke through her expensive makeup, streaking the carefully painted surface of her face. No, that's impossible," she stammered, her voice splintering into panic. "You're lying. Jason's lawyer said you couldn't do that by yourself. You're senile. Our power of attorney—" I let out a small, cold laugh. "The power of attorney was signed with disappearing ink, sweetheart. I am an investigator. I would never leave my real signature on a financial death warrant written by my own predators. This house no longer belongs to me, and it was never, ever going to belong to you." Then I looked directly into her widening eyes. "The developer has already secured the demolition permit. Their excavators will roll into the front yard at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Her face went white. "So I strongly suggest you stop crying for the cameras and start packing. You have exactly 10 hours to go upstairs, collect your designer clothes, your overpriced cosmetics, and every other useless luxury item you dragged into this house. Anything still inside after 8 tomorrow morning will be crushed beneath the tracks of a demolition machine." I let every word fall slowly. No extensions, no negotiation, no mercy. Then I gave her the truth in its final form. "You officially became homeless at your own party tonight." Maya's panic finally broke through the surface. She collapsed onto the lawn, clutching the hem of her ivory silk dress in both hands. She searched the faces around her for pity, for support, for one shred of sympathy. She found none. Only cold glances, only whispers, only the disgusted silence of people watching a humiliation too complete to interrupt. The perfect social media image had been torn off her like rotting wallpaper, leaving behind exactly what she really was, a pathetic gold digger staring straight into total ruin. I looked down at her without the slightest trace of mercy. The first number in my audit had been settled. Now it was time to calculate the next debt. I shifted my gaze from my daughter-in-law collapsing on the lawn to my fraudulent son. Jason was still standing frozen on the wooden platform, his arms hanging limp at his sides. The polished image of a promising young tech executive had shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but the cowardice of a child caught stealing. He stared at me with eyes flooded with panic. His pale lips kept moving, but no sound came out. Cold sweat beaded across his forehead, soaking the carefully styled hair that had been lacquered into place. I gave a small nod to the technician behind the soundboard. The giant projector screen behind me immediately switched to the third set of documents. Bright red numbers slammed into the eyes of everyone in the crowd. A high-resolution bank statement and a scanned credit agreement filled the screen. "This second gift," I said evenly, each word carrying the weight of a sledgehammer, "is reserved especially for you, Jason. A few moments ago, you stood on this stage and called yourself a successful entrepreneur. You told all of these distinguished guests about your glorious startup. You spoke about vision innovation and million-dollar projects waiting in the future. But there was one very small and very important detail you somehow forgot to mention." I lifted my hand and pointed at the loan agreement glowing on the screen. "You forgot to mention how you raised the money to keep that polished little illusion alive." I let the silence tighten around him. "This," I said, "is a $500,000 home equity line of credit. It was issued exactly 4 months ago. The collateral listed is the house you foolishly believed was still in my name. And the most interesting part of all is waiting on the final page of the agreement. I turned slightly toward the audience. Please look very carefully. The screen zoomed in on the signature line. There it was. Evelyn Pierce. A beautiful blue ink signature, smooth and elegant, perfectly legal to the untrained eye. The crowd below began murmuring. The investors who had been clinking glasses with Jason only moments ago were now squinting at him with expressions twisted by suspicion and disgust. A few of them even stepped backward as if my son had suddenly become contagious. An ordinary person might believe that is my handwriting. I continued, my cold voice slicing through the noise. But I am not an ordinary person. I spent 30 years of my life examining fraudulent financial documents. The angle of the lowercase e is wrong. The pen pressure on the P is too rigid. It lacks the natural glide of a woman who has signed her own name thousands of times. You hired a corrupt notary or broker to authenticate this forgery. You used your own mother's name to steal $500,000 from the banking system. Jason began trembling violently. His knees buckled for a second, as if the weight of the truth were crushing his bones. He lifted one hand as though he wanted to snatch the microphone away from me, but my stare pinned him in place. His hand froze in the air, then slowly dropped back to his side. "Mom, please," he whispered low enough for only me to hear. His eyes were begging now, pathetic and desperate. "We can handle this inside the house. Please don't do this in front of them. My company will be destroyed." I ignored him completely. My pity had been drained dry 15 years ago, the night I sold my father's watch to save him from his own disaster. I turned back to the crowd. "And if that $500,000 had truly been used to save your technology company," I said, "I might have been willing to call it youthful recklessness. But numbers do not lie, Jason. They tell a very honest story. And I followed every dollar." The screen flickered again. Now it showed a detailed flow of funds chart I had built myself. Red arrows traced the path of every stolen dollar. Not 1 cent, I said, went into payroll. Not 1 cent went into research and development. Not 1 cent was used to rescue your company. The entire $500,000 loan was broken apart and routed into a hidden personal account. From there, it became the newest Porsche parked so proudly in the driveway. It became luxury parties. It became expensive Florida vacations. And of course it became the $15,000 designer handbag hanging from your wife's shoulder. The silence in the garden shattered into open outrage. Some of the men in tailored suits were already pulling out their phones to call their private attorneys. They had just realized they had been seduced by a professional fraudster man who had looted his own family to finance a costume of success and lure investors into his trap. "Do you know what the law calls this, Jason?" I asked, stepping closer, lowering my voice just enough for the microphone to capture every word with perfect clarity. "Under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, using electronic communications to execute a scheme to defraud and obtain money, is called wire fraud. Under Section 513, this is financial document forgery." I looked directly into his eyes. The same eyes that had looked at me with arrogance and contempt 1 month earlier now held nothing but terror and emptiness. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked wrinkled and pitiful. "This is not a family disagreement over allowance money or inheritance," I said, my voice turning hard as steel. "These are federal criminal charges, serious ones. Each count carries the possibility of up to 20 years in prison. You used your illusion of success to dig yourself into a very deep hole. You thought throwing me into a nursing home would bury this secret forever. But tonight, I am simply the one pushing you into the grave you dug for yourself." Jason stumbled backward 2 steps and slammed into the microphone stand. He nearly fell. Both hands flew to his head as if he could somehow stop my words from drilling through his skull. He had lost everything: his startup, his reputation, his future, and most of all, his freedom. The perfect mask had been stripped clean away, leaving nothing behind but a pathetic financial criminal shaking beneath crystal lights. I straightened my posture and smoothed the folds of my navy silk dress. 2 delusional predators had already been destroyed on their own stage. Only one last coward remained, hiding somewhere in the darkness of the garden. I turned my eyes away from my trembling son and shifted my attention to the last rat in this filthy alliance. Richard, my ex-husband. He was slowly backing away, trying to slip beyond the edge of the stage lights. He tugged at the front of his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and forced his face into an expression of profound disappointment. He was trying to create physical distance between himself and Jason, as if he could somehow convince every person in that garden that he had nothing to do with the fraud. Evelyn, I truly had no idea the boy was capable of something this disgraceful, Richard said in his thick voice, desperately performing the part of an upright, honorable father. Financial fraud is an unforgivable crime. I agree with you completely. He must answer for it before the law. What a shameful stain on our family name. I smiled faintly. A thin, contemptuous smile. A sewer rat always knows how to step on another rat to climb higher when the ship begins to sink. What moving moral wisdom, Richard said, my tone light, but venom running beneath every word. But perhaps you should save that sermon for your own trial. I gave the technician a third nod. The projector screen flickered once, then switched to a new set of statements. These were no longer domestic banking records. This time, the screen displayed documents bearing the logo of a private bank in the Cayman Islands. In the upper right corner was the incorporation certificate of a limited liability company called Blue Horizon Investments. Richard's face collapsed instantly. The artificial tan seemed to drain straight out of his skin, leaving behind a sick gray mask of raw terror. His old eyes widened as he stared at the figures flashing across the giant screen. 2 years ago, when we divorced, you swore under oath that your real estate company was failing. I said each word crisp and clear against the rustling night wind. You submitted beautifully falsified balance sheets to convince the court you were teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. You insisted my retirement fund should remain untouched, yet refused to divide half the value of the assets we built together over 30 years. The court believed you. Your young mistress believed you. I took one slow step toward him. But you forgot one thing. You were married to an IRS investigator. I never stopped tracking your financial tricks. Blue Horizon Investments is not an offshore investment fund. It is a shell company, a financial black hole you built to launder millions of dollars in profits from commercial real estate deals. You moved the money across borders disguised as fake consulting contracts. The wine glass in Richard's hand began to shake violently. A few dark drops spilled over the rim and splashed onto his expensive silk shirt, blooming like bloodstains. His breathing turned ragged and uneven. Around him, investors and guests began whispering and pointing. Some of them were former business associates he had cheated in the marketplace. They were starting to realize the man standing in front of them was not a successful businessman at all. He was a professional parasite. That night you came to my house with a fake appraiser. I continued pressing him harder with every naked fact. You threatened to reopen our divorce case to steal the last remaining half of my home's value. You wanted to drive me into ruin so you could fund your degenerate luxury lifestyle. And how convenient, because that is exactly what I wanted too. The only difference is that the person reopening your file will not be a family court judge. I let the silence sharpen. It will be the Economic Crimes Division. The screen shifted one final time. Now it displayed a completed IRS Form 3949-A stamped in red as officially received, the formal report used to expose tax fraud and concealed assets. I submitted the full flow of funds analysis along with your Cayman account list 2 weeks ago. I said, my voice never rising yet heavy enough to crush whatever resistance he had left. Knowingly concealing assets during divorce proceedings is perjury. Evading millions in federal income tax is a serious economic crime. You will not be wintering in Miami with your young mistress, Richard. She will leave the moment she discovers your accounts have been frozen, and you will spend the next 20 years of your life inside a federal prison. The entire shell of arrogant superiority around that faithless man collapsed at once. His legs gave way beneath him. He lurched sideways and had to slam one hand against a glass serving table just to keep from falling face first onto the lawn. He opened his mouth trying to force out some excuse, some lie, some final defense, but his throat was so dry that nothing came out except heavy, broken gasps. The gold-plated watch on his wrist now looked absurd and cheap, exactly like his character. No one in the crowd felt sorry for him anymore. No one felt pity for this family at all. They looked at him the way people look at a corpse waiting to be claimed by the law. He had wanted to steal my security in old age, and now I had stripped him with my own hands of every last thing he had left: his money, his freedom, and the final scraps of his dignity. I stood tall, arms folded across my chest, and let myself savor the deadly silence, swallowing the 3 traitors whole. The deed had already been transferred. The forged mortgage had been exposed. The shell company tax file had already been delivered to the government. The balance sheet of betrayal had been presented flawlessly, without a single error. The game was over, and I was the only one still standing. The air in the garden had grown thick, heavy with a deadly kind of silence. More than 100 wealthy guests, without a single word exchanged, had instinctively stepped backward in unison, forming a wide circle that completely isolated the center stage. The clinking of glasses was gone. The murmuring had died. All that remained was the December wind moving through the hydrangea trees and the ragged breathing of the 3 people who had just been stripped of every layer of their perfect disguise. Jason stood trembling, his eyes wide and vacant. Maya had collapsed onto the grass, both hands covering her face as she sobbed in disgrace. Richard leaned against the catering table, his aging face drained of color, looking more like a corpse than a man. I stood on the highest part of the stage and looked down at them with calm, merciless eyes. The psychological game was over, and now it was time for reality to knock on the door. At the exact moment their despair reached its lowest point, a sound sliced through the stillness from the far end of the tree-lined road leading into the neighborhood. At first it was only a long, low wail, but within seconds it grew louder, sharper, more relentless. Police sirens. Not one vehicle. A convoy. The sound ricocheted off the brick walls of the mansion and rolled back across the lawn like a funeral bell. Jason jerked so hard his whole body seemed to spasm. His eyes snapped wildly toward the front gate. His jaw began chattering uncontrollably. Maya stopped crying and lifted her smeared, ruined face, her breathing suddenly turning shallow and frantic like a drowning woman fighting for air. Under the dim yellow streetlights, flashes of red and blue began sweeping across the front of the house. 4 black federal SUVs and 2 county financial crimes patrol cars came screaming to a stop at the edge of the property, gravel grinding beneath their tires with a harsh, brutal hiss. Every door flew open at once. Men in windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back stepped out fast and hard. Their boots struck the pavement with a force that seemed to press down on the entire party. At the front of them was Marcus Vance, my former student. He walked with the clipped, disciplined precision of a man who had spent years learning how to carry authority like a weapon. His face revealed nothing. The crystal lights from the party caught the bronze badge clipped to his belt and made it gleam. The guests immediately scattered to both sides, opening a clear path for law enforcement to move through. No one dared say a word. Marcus walked straight toward the oak stage where Jason and I were standing. When he was only 2 steps away from me, he stopped, dipped his head slightly, and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of quiet respect to his old professor. I gave him a small nod in return. Then Marcus turned his eyes to Jason, the gaze of a federal agent locked onto the con man trembling inside an expensive tuxedo. Jason Pierce. Marcus said, his voice deep and sharp. The microphone in my hand caught every word and carried it across the garden so that every guest heard it clearly. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are charged with wire fraud, financial document forgery, and unlawful appropriation of high-value assets. Jason staggered backward until his body slammed into the giant projection screen behind him. No, that's not me," he stammered, his voice shrill with pure panic. "This is a misunderstanding. The money belongs to my family. My mother is sick. She doesn't understand what she's doing. Please just listen to me. Let me explain." Marcus did not blink. He stepped forward once and pulled a pair of polished steel handcuffs from his belt. "The figures in the home equity loan file and the security footage from the notary office are not sick," Mr. Pierce Marcus said coldly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney." 2 other agents moved in immediately, one from each side. They seized Jason's arms and forced them behind his back while he struggled in weak, useless bursts. Then came the sound, a single metallic click, sharp, clean, final. The handcuffs locked around his wrists. It was not a loud sound, but it was the most decisive sound of the night, the sound that crushed the last illusion of a brilliant young executive. Jason's head dropped. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, and only the grip of the agents kept him from collapsing onto the wooden floorboards. His tailored evening wear was wrinkled now, pitiful and broken. Every ounce of arrogance, every filthy plan to shove me into a nursing home and steal my house had been reduced to nothing beneath that cold steel. And the moment the handcuffs snapped shut, the media team and camera operators Maya herself had hired exploded into action. Flashes burst across the garden in violent waves, bright as lightning in a clear sky. Cameras pointed straight at Jason's pale, sweat-soaked face, capturing every second of his humiliation. They had wanted to use media to shame me, to force me into publicly admitting that I was a senile old woman losing her mind. And now those same lenses were broadcasting the image of a federal criminal being arrested at his own fraudulent charity gala. Down on the lawn, another group of officers was already moving toward Richard. My greedy ex-husband had been trying to slip through the crowd toward the back gate, but 2 tall officers cut him off before he made it 3 steps. Richard Pierce, one of them, said, "We have a summons requiring your cooperation in an investigation involving offshore tax evasion and concealment of assets. You are ordered to surrender your passport and remain within the jurisdiction." Richard froze where he stood. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Every trace of smug superiority evaporated from his face. Maya was still collapsed on the grass, crying into her hands. No one put handcuffs on her, but the sentence waiting for her was no less brutal. She had to watch her husband being led away. She had to watch her luxury party turn into an active crime scene. And she knew that by tomorrow morning she would be thrown out with nothing when the demolition equipment rolled in and tore the house apart. I remained standing on the stage, both arms resting easily at my sides. I did not mock them. I did not laugh. I did not scream in triumph. I simply stood there, wrapped in the absolute authority of a person holding the truth. The guests looked up at me, and there was no pity left in their eyes now. Only awe, only fear. They understood at last that the 62-year-old woman in the navy dress was never prey. She was a hunter, a patient one. A woman who had built a trap with her own hands and then used the greed of her enemies to tighten it around their throats. The night wind lifted the silver strands at my forehead. Thanksgiving was over, and the traitors had finally paid the final balance of their lives with the only currency they had left, their freedom. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the roar of a diesel engine ripped through the quiet air of the old neighborhood. I stood on the second-floor balcony with a cup of hot chamomile tea in my hand, calmly looking down at the front lawn. A massive, bright yellow excavator from the construction company was slowly rolling through the rusted iron gate, crushing the last white orchid arrangements left behind from the shallow spectacle of the night before. Its metal tracks carved deep, brutal lines into the wet, muddy ground. Down on the lawn, Maya was struggling to drag 2 oversized black suitcases behind her. Overnight, she had lost the executive husband she used to cling to, and the arrogant father-in-law she once leaned on was gone too. She had spent the entire night shoving designer clothes and overpriced cosmetics into those suitcases before her deadline ran out. The proud ivory silk dress she had worn the night before was now wrinkled and smeared with dirt. Her expensive high heels kept sinking into the wet grass, making her stumble again and again. The glamorous image of a social media influencer had been stripped away completely, leaving behind nothing but a gold digger running from the wreckage her own greed had built. The moment she saw me step out onto the porch, Maya stopped. Her swollen eyes lifted to mine, filled with a hatred so raw it trembled beside her despair. With clumsy, shaking fingers, she reached into her expensive handbag, now streaked with mud, and pulled out a shining brass house key. It was the duplicate Jason had made without my permission and proudly handed to her the week before as a symbol of their takeover. She threw it down onto the stone step at my feet, and it landed with a hard metallic crack. "Are you satisfied now?" Maya hissed through clenched teeth, her voice sharp and broken. "You destroyed your son's life. You threw your own daughter-in-law out onto the street. You're a cold-blooded woman." I did not bend down to pick up the key. I simply nudged it gently with the toe of my soft leather shoe and sent it rolling back toward her mud-stained heels. Then I looked straight into those swollen eyes without the slightest flicker of pity. "Keep it as a souvenir, Maya," I said, my voice calm and light as drifting wind. "It's the key to an illusion you created for yourselves. This house is about to cease to exist, and so is that fake family you just mentioned. Next time you try to build a brand around perfection, make sure you're not building it with stolen money and on the land of a forensic accountant." Then I turned my back, stepped up onto the porch, and took a slow sip of hot tea, leaving her there trembling in the cold wind. Behind me, the excavator roared louder. Its giant steel arm rose into the air, preparing to deliver the first crushing blow to the front of the house. Everything rotten had to be leveled so something new could finally begin. A month after that storm, I was sitting on the balcony of a sun-drenched luxury apartment in Carmel by the sea. The Pacific breeze swept in cool and clean, carrying the salt of the ocean and the soft rhythm of waves crashing against the cliffs. I wore a silk robe, sipped a perfectly brewed cup of Earl Grey, and let my eyes rest on the endless blue horizon. No more nagging over utility bills. No more cheap emotional manipulation. No more fraudsters hiding behind the title of family. There was only absolute freedom and the kind of peace I had spent half a lifetime buying back for myself. On the small glass table beside my chair, my tablet screen displayed a freshly delivered email from Marcus. My former student, now a federal agent, had sent me the final update on the trap I had laid so carefully. My son Jason had officially been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud and financial document forgery. No suspended sentence. No mercy for a man who deliberately stole from an elderly woman. As for Maya, the daughter-in-law who once flaunted designer handbags like trophies, she was now filing for personal bankruptcy and moving into her parents' basement. And Richard, my worthless ex-husband, had fared even worse. The IRS had frozen every bank account he had hidden in the Cayman Islands. His real estate assets had been seized as part of the investigation. His glamorous 35-year-old mistress packed her bags and vanished the very first night the authorities came knocking, leaving him alone with a mountain of tax debt and the very real possibility of spending the next 10 years behind bars. They wanted to strip away my safety net, and in the end, they wove a sentence around their own futures with their own greedy hands. I set my teacup down and smiled as the morning sun warmed my face. For 30 years I had denied myself comfort. I had worked through endless nights. I had sacrificed every personal pleasure to give them a life of security and abundance. I once believed that was the duty of a wife, the duty of a mother. But when they started treating that sacrifice like an entitlement and prepared to cast me aside like an old piece of furniture, I finally understood the truth. My money is mine. The wealth earned through the sweat and intellect of a forensic accountant was never meant to fall into the hands of the ungrateful. This luxury apartment, this extended retreat by the sea, this life where I no longer have to fear tomorrow, every bit of it was paid for honestly by my own labor. I had finally stopped setting myself on fire just to keep cold-hearted people warm. I closed my eyes and took one long, deep breath, letting myself fully savor every second of Chapter 2 of my life, a chapter that was bright, free, and forever closed to deceit. To all the women watching this video, especially those of you stepping into your 50s, 60s, or 70s, we come from a generation that was taught that motherhood meant sacrificing every part of ourselves. We poured out our youth, our health, and even our smallest personal dreams just to build a strong foundation for our children to stand on. We truly believed that one day all that unconditional love would be repaid with deep respect and gratitude when we grew older. But sometimes the truth in this world is far harsher than we ever imagined. A mother's love is sacred. It is powerful. But it should never become a blank check that ungrateful children can fill in with the endless numbers of their greed. Never allow your silent sacrifices to become the very weapons someone uses against you. Never hand over control of your finances, ownership of your home, or the security of your later years just because someone wraps manipulation in the language of family love. You worked too hard for everything you built. Those property deeds, savings accounts, and retirement funds are not just money. They are your sweat, your tears, your sleepless nights. And more than anything, they are your freedom, the freedom you earned for the most important years of your life. If you still hold that financial power in your hands, hold on to it tightly. No one, not even the people who share your blood, has the right to take away the peace you worked your whole life to deserve. And if my story today touched something in your own life, if you have also had to quietly face ingratitude from the very people you loved most, then tell me in the comments below. I truly want to hear your story. How did you set boundaries to protect yourself? What would you do if you found yourself in my position, facing betrayal from your own son and your ex-husband? Share it with me and share it with this community. Because no woman should ever have to stand alone in the fight to protect her worth and her dignity. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more powerful stories about awakening justice and the kind of legal revenge that is fully deserved. Our journey does not end here. In the next video, I'll tell you the story of a 65-year-old woman who used a prenuptial agreement hidden for 30 years to make her cheating husband and his young mistress walk out of the house with nothing but the clothes on their backs right in the middle of their wedding anniversary party. Check the link in the description so you don't miss that story. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And always remember this: your truly beautiful life may only be just beginning from this very moment on.